Please? Not here. Not today, and certainly not in front of my son, please.
Linda Parker begged, her voice shaking as her in-laws pressed a set of rusted van keys into her hand. The autumn air was crisp, but the coldness she felt had nothing to do with the weather. The hush over the funeral crowd broke into whispers, but David's family only smirked. 7 months pregnant with her little boy clinging to her dress, Linda stood frozen as they announced, in front of everyone, that this battered van was all she would ever inherit. The estate was gone. The house was gone. Savings meant for their child's future were swept from her life like nothing. But what stung most was the timing. David's body wasn't even cold in the ground, and here they were, dividing up his life like vultures over carrion. The lawyer had barely finished reading the will when David's brother stepped forward with those keys, dangling them like a cruel joke. "This is what you get," he whispered loud enough for the front row to hear. "Consider yourself lucky we're giving you anything at all." Laughter rose where comfort should have lived, a cold sound that cut deeper than grief. To them, she was a burden to mock and forget. David's mother adjusted her black designer gloves and whispered to her sister, "I always said she was just after the money. Now look what she's left with." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some looking away in embarrassment, others leaning in closer to catch every cruel word. What they never imagined was that the very van they sneered at carried a secret so powerful it would one day silence every cruel word. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In the days that followed, gossip traveled faster than sympathy. The small town buzzed with whispers over coffee cups and grocery store checkout lines. Neighbors said she should accept her place. After all, what did she really contribute to the Parker family fortune? Distant relatives shrugged and called it fate, saying David had always been too soft-hearted for his own good. Even her own mother called, voice thick with disappointment, asking why Linda hadn't been smarter about protecting herself. Linda kept her head down, focusing on her son's needs and preparing for the baby that would arrive in just 2 months. But every night she lay awake replaying the last weeks of David's life. He had grown careful, almost watchful, like a man carrying a secret too heavy to share. She remembered how he'd started checking over his shoulder when they went out, how he'd begun taking different routes home from work. He'd started locking the shed and spending long stretches in that van, saying he was clearing space and fixing odds and ends. But David was never handy with tools. He could barely change a light bulb without calling for help. So why was he suddenly so interested in automotive repair? And why did he always emerge from those sessions looking more worried, not less? Linda remembered the night she'd found him sitting at their kitchen table at 3 a.m., staring at papers spread before him, his face pale in the moonlight. When she'd asked what was wrong, he'd quickly gathered the documents and kissed her forehead. "Just business stuff," he'd said. "Nothing for you to worry about." Why would a man who loved his wife and child leave them nothing? Why would he allow a public humiliation that stained his name as much as hers? Questions gathered like storm clouds, and one thought refused to leave. If the van was only junk, why did he keep it close, guarded like something worth far more than metal and memories? David had never shown interest in that van before his final months. It had sat unused in their driveway for years, an eyesore that his family constantly mocked. So why, suddenly, had it become so important to him? Would you have sold it for cash, or held on and listened to that quiet tug of doubt? Let me know what you would have done in the comments below. Before the marriage, the Parkers had smiled for photographs, but Linda had always felt the chill behind the frame. She remembered her first family dinner, how the conversation stopped when she mentioned her job as a nurse's aide, how David's mother had asked pointed questions about her background, her family's financial situation, her intentions toward their son. David's father admired power more than character, and his mother treated new people like stains that might not wash out. The Parker family had built their fortune in construction and real estate, developing half the commercial districts in their county. They owned restaurants, strip malls, and apartment complexes, their name on bronze plaques throughout the city. David was supposed to take over the family business, but he'd never shown much interest in the wheeling and dealing that excited his brothers. Instead, he'd chosen a quiet job in architectural drafting, preferring to design buildings rather than own them. David tried to shield Linda from the family politics, moving them to a modest home outside the city, away from family expectations and the endless measuring of status. The house was small, but perfect. 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen where they cooked together, and a backyard just big enough for their son to play. He built furniture on weekends, learned to cook simple meals, and taught their son to plant tomatoes in a little square of soil by the fence. They were happiest when no one was watching, when they could pretend the Parker name didn't come with strings attached. Even then, the van had been there, an aging box on wheels that David claimed he'd bought for projects. It was a 1998 Dodge Ram van, white paint faded to cream, with rust spots along the wheel wells and a cracked windshield that never seemed to bother him. It annoyed the neighbors and embarrassed his parents, which, oddly, seemed to make him keep it longer. His father had offered multiple times to buy him a proper vehicle, something that wouldn't reflect poorly on the family name, but David always refused. The van didn't match their life, and that was exactly why Linda could not look away. Everything about David was neat, organized, purposeful. So why this one chaotic element? Why this one thing that seemed so out of character? The will reading did not begin with cruelty, but it ended there. The Parker family attorney, a man who'd served their interest for 30 years, had arranged the reading in the family's mahogany-paneled conference room. Linda had arrived with her own lawyer, a young woman fresh from law school who specialized in family law, and had agreed to work for a reduced fee. The contrast was stark. The Parkers with their team of expensive suits, Linda with her single advocate and her toddler son fidgeting in her lap. Lawyers love papers that sound final, and the Parkers loved the kind of wealth that makes men feel permanent. Names were called, gifts announced with ceremonial weight. David's eldest brother inherited the largest share of company stock. The second brother received the family's vacation properties. Various cousins and relatives were granted smaller parcels of assets, each bequest read aloud with the gravity of a royal decree. Then came Linda's turn. She listened as the attorney explained how David's shares were assigned to his brothers under prior agreement, an agreement she'd never seen or heard of. The family home was returned to the family trust per security clause, a clause that apparently predated their marriage. Bank accounts were reallocated per succession plan, a plan that seemed designed to ensure she received nothing of value. The words felt like a vanishing act performed with legal ink. Linda's lawyer scribbled notes frantically, but the documents seemed airtight, every loophole closed, every possibility for contest eliminated. It was as if David had never been married, never had a family of his own, never built a life separate from his parents' empire. When the keys dropped into Linda's hand, the room made a sound she would never forget, a blend of relief and entertainment, as if a show had ended exactly as some had hoped. David's mother actually chuckled, a sound like ice cracking. "Well," she said, adjusting her pearls, "at least now you have transportation to find yourself a job." It is an old habit in certain rooms to confuse cruelty with order. The Parkers had perfected this art, making their malice seem like natural consequence, their greed appear as responsible stewardship. Tell me, if you had stood there with a child's hand in yours, would you have screamed? Or would you have swallowed the fire to keep the child from burning too? Weeks passed, and the van never moved. It sat like a dare in the driveway, paint flaking, glass fogged with dust, tires sighing into the dirt. Linda found herself staring at it through her kitchen window, this ugly reminder of everything she'd lost. Creditors began calling. Apparently David's life insurance had been assigned to pay business debts she'd known nothing about. The modest savings account they'd shared was frozen pending estate resolution. Even their joint credit cards were canceled without warning. Linda cleaned the van one quiet afternoon because cleaning was the one act left that felt like control. She needed to understand why David had spent so much time with this particular piece of junk. Maybe if she looked closely enough, She could find some clue about what he'd been thinking in those final months. The interior was surprisingly well maintained despite the exterior's shabby appearance. The seats were worn but clean, the dashboard free of the usual accumulated dust and debris. She vacuumed the mats, wiped the dash, rolled the windows down to let the air turn over. Her son climbed inside and pretended it was a rocket ship, making engine noises and calling out countdown sequences. She smiled for him, grateful for any moment of lightness in their increasingly dark world. It was then that she noticed something ordinary that became impossible to ignore. A line in the paneling that didn't quite belong, a seam within a seam, as if a careful hand had added a skin to the inside. The panel was behind the driver's seat, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Linda might have missed it entirely if her son hadn't been crawling around the interior, his small fingers tracing every surface with the thorough curiosity of childhood. "Mom," he said, "this feels funny." She traced it, pressed lightly, then harder. It shifted. She paused, listening for the voice that says stop, and when it did not come, she pulled. What would you do when the first edge gives way? Close it and choose peace, or open it and choose truth? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Behind the panel lay a flat envelope bound with twine, the kind of paper that carries weight even before you read it. Linda's hands trembled as she lifted it out, noting how perfectly it fit the hidden compartment, as if this space had been created specifically for this purpose. Inside were neatly folded letters in David's handwriting, a small notebook with columns of dates and figures, and the faint smell of a workshop where wood and metal meet. Linda sat in the driver's seat and read. The letters were addressed to her, written over months, maybe a year, each one gentle and steady as if David was leaving stepping stones across a river. The first was dated almost 18 months earlier, just after she'd announced her second pregnancy. "My dearest Linda," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I didn't find another way. It means they won, but not completely, not if you're smart about what comes next." He wrote about sleepless nights, about men he no longer trusted, about protecting what mattered when the usual trusts and signatures could be twisted by people who wanted control more than fairness. He detailed conversations with his father and brothers, meetings where they discussed contingency plans for his share of the business, plans that became clearer as Linda read on. They'd been systematically moving to cut him out, using his gentle nature and trusting disposition against him. "They think I'm weak," one letter read, "because I chose love over leverage, because I picked you over their plans for me. They don't understand that love makes you stronger, not weaker. They don't know that a man will do anything, absolutely anything, to protect his family." He wrote about the van, how something ordinary is often the best place to keep what others think is worth taking. "They laugh at this old van, Linda. They see rust and failure. But sometimes the best safe is one that doesn't look like a safe at all." He ended the last letter with a sentence that opened a door. "If you're reading this, you're not alone anymore. Everything you need to fight them is here. Use it all." The notebook did not sparkle, but numbers can outshine diamonds when they tell a story true enough to change a life. Inside were lists of serial numbers and certificates, a map of locations and safety deposit box keys, initials matched to dates, and a ledger of purchases that did not match the modest salary the Parkers liked to believe David earned. There were receipts for precious metals, invoices for collectible coins, records of rare instruments quietly sold and replaced with more portable assets. Most shocking of all were entries showing systematic transfers from family business accounts, not theft but legitimate withdrawals of his rightful share, moved months in advance of any formal attempt to cut him out. David had seen what was coming and had quietly, methodically, protected what was rightfully his family's. There was also a photocopy of a document Linda had never seen, the formation of a trust with their son as beneficiary and Linda as trustee, funded not by family accounts, but by assets David had moved, one quiet transaction at a time. The notebook did not shout. It simply said, "Stand up." Do you believe in plans made by love when surrounded by people who trade promises like currency? Let me know in the comments what you think of David's secret plan. A second panel, thinner and harder to find, hid a small steel box bolted to the frame. The key was taped beneath the steering column, where only patient hands would look. Inside, velvet pouches were arranged with care, the navy fabric worn smooth at the corners from David's nervous handling. Coins gleamed with old faces and old years, each sealed with professional documentation. A slim folder held bearer bonds and certificates, whose current value would make a banker's eyes widen. 2 thin keys were taped to a card with bank names and branch addresses in 3 different states. At the bottom of the box lay a simple wedding photo, the edges softened by touch, a note beneath it in David's hand. When they try to take what was never theirs, start here. I love you both more than they could ever understand. Linda did not cry the way people expect in stories. She put everything back exactly as she'd found it, locked the van, and made a list. Some victories begin with a pen that finally writes the truth. But this is just the beginning of Linda's incredible journey. What happened when the Parker family discovered what David had really left behind? How did Linda use these hidden assets to turn the tables on her cruel in-laws? And what was the final confrontation that left the powerful Parker family speechless? The Parkers noticed the change immediately, because people who clutch power bruise easily when they feel it shift. Linda had stopped returning their calls, stopped accepting their generous offers of help with the baby preparations. A brother drove by slowly, noting the van was now clean, the lawn was freshly mowed, and Linda moved with new purpose. A cousin sent carefully worded text messages dressed as concern, but clearly fishing for information about Linda's plans. The family's lawyer called with an offer to revisit the estate settlement, suggesting there might be assets they'd overlooked. David's mother showed up unannounced with baby clothes and criticism, probing for signs of desperation she could exploit. When Linda met each overture with polite but firm refusal, the family grew suspicious. Their concerns intensified when Linda hired a new attorney, not the overwhelmed public defender they'd expected, but a seasoned estate litigation specialist from the state capitol. She found Rebecca Martinez through David's hidden notes, a lawyer he'd researched extensively, known for taking on powerful families and winning. Linda practiced a sentence until it was strong enough to stand without shaking. "My lawyer will be in touch." She used it like a shield, deflecting every Parker attempt to manipulate or intimidate. When David's father tried his old tricks, the combination of threat and false kindness that had always worked before, Linda simply smiled and repeated her new mantra. She arrived at Rebecca's office with the notebook, the letters, the coins, the keys, and the steel box, each item placed on the mahogany table like evidence in a trial. The attorney read quietly, occasionally making notes, her expression growing more intrigued with each revelation. When she finished, she looked up with the expression of a person who has found a path through tangled woods. "Mrs. Parker," Rebecca said, "your husband was either very lucky or very smart, probably both. You have time. Statute of limitations works in your favor. You have proof. Everything is documented and witnessed. And most of all, you have intent. His intent, written in his hand, legally executed and completely unassailable. Would you feel fear first, or would you finally breathe? Tell me in the comments which emotion you think you'd experience first. Banks are not built for speed when caution is the bridge to safety, but Linda found the process surprisingly smooth. David had prepared for everything, including instructions on how to approach each institution, which documents to present, and even which teller windows typically had the shortest wait times. The first branch manager examined the key, checked the card against his computer system, and glanced at Linda with newfound respect. Each safety deposit box revealed another layer of David's careful planning. Securities that had doubled in value since purchase, precious metals bought when prices were low, foreign currency purchased as hedge against domestic instability, and most importantly, a complete paper trail showing every transaction was legal, properly documented, and clearly separate from any Parker family assets. But the real crown jewel was the sealed letter addressed to Rebecca Martinez, written months before David's death, outlining exactly how Linda should proceed if the family tried to cheat her out of her inheritance. David had anticipated every legal move the Parkers might make and had prepared counter-strategies for each one. The family sued, of course, but their case fell apart under scrutiny. They claimed undue influence, but David's letters were clearly written over time, in his own hand, with witnesses who confirmed his mental competency. They questioned signatures, but handwriting experts confirmed authenticity. They argued the trust was fraudulent, but every document was properly notarized and filed. Most damaging to their case was their own attorney, who was forced to admit under oath that the family had discussed managing David's inheritance months before his death, revealing their predatory intentions. A former business partner, tired of the Parker family's bullying tactics, testified about conversations where David's brothers had openly discussed forcing him out of the business. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Linda retained control of all assets David had legally moved into trust, plus punitive damages for the family's attempt to defraud her. The Parker family name, once synonymous with business success, became associated with greed and cruelty toward a widowed mother. News traveled differently this time. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the young widow who had outmaneuvered one of the county's most powerful families. Social media buzzed with support for Linda and condemnation of the Parkers' heartless behavior at the funeral. The family was forced into hiding, their business reputation in tatters. But Linda's story doesn't end with legal victory. 6 months later, as she sat in the restored van with her newborn daughter sleeping peacefully in the car seat David had hidden money to buy, Linda made a decision that would honor her husband's memory in ways the Parker family could never have imagined. She established the David Parker Memorial Foundation, using a portion of the recovered assets to help other families facing similar situations. Women left vulnerable after a spouse's death, children whose inheritances had been stolen by greedy relatives, families destroyed by those who mistake wealth for worth. The van became a symbol of hope, traveling to schools and community centers where Linda shared her story, teaching others that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the quietest places, that love finds ways to protect even when the lovers cannot stay, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, has perfect aim when guided by careful hands and courageous hearts. This is what happened when a family tried to turn grief into theater, and a woman refused to let shame write the final line. They mocked her with metal and were answered with evidence. They measured her by their comfort and learned that comfort is a poor teacher. The secret inside the van did not make Linda better than anyone. It simply returned what love had set aside for her and her children. If you stood where she stood, would you have held the line as long as she did? Or would you have taken the first offer of peace and called it victory? Your reasons matter more than your answer, because reasons are the map you keep when applause fades. What did you think of Linda's incredible journey? Have you ever had to stand up to powerful people who underestimated you? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. I love hearing your stories. If you enjoyed this tale of hidden strength and ultimate justice, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that even in our darkest moments, hope can be hiding in the most unexpected places. See you in my next video, where we'll explore another amazing story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things.